Practical Anarchy, Guide to Self-Determination, Dickie Dredd. Chapter 4, The State, the Problem with the State. Section 22, Introduction. What do we mean by state? When anarchists say the state, we are not talking simply about whichever government happens to be in office. The state is something bigger and stickier, a structure of power that remains in place no matter who is elected or what party colours are waved at the ballot box. Politicians come and go, parliaments swing left and right, but the state itself endures. At its core, the state claims a monopoly on legitimate violence. As Max Weber famously defined it, the state is the human community which successfully lays claim to the monopoly of legitimate physical violence within a given territory. This monopoly is enforced through police, prisons, armies, borders and surveillance, the hard edges of authority. The state decides who may strike, who may protest, who may cross a line on a map. It claims the power to define crime, to punish, to kill. But the state is more than brute force. It is also bureaucracy, the endless paperwork, laws and regulations that govern daily life. From birth certificates to tax returns, from planning permissions to passports, the state embeds itself in the most intimate corners of existence. Think of the endless queues at the benefits office, the labyrinth of online forms to apply for housing, or the biometric scans demanded at airports. These are not accidental irritations. They are the state asserting its right to categorise, record and permit. And then there is the system, a phrase that crops up in everyday speech, often used interchangeably with the state. When someone says the state is broken, they may be talking about government inefficiency, corruption or bureaucracy, but anarchists tend to see the system as something broader, the fusion of state, capital and ideology into a machinery of domination. The state provides the laws, the police and the prisons. Capital provides the wealth, the corporations and the jobs. Ideology provides the myths, nationalisms, meritocracy, consumerism that make it all seem inevitable. Together these form what people call the system. The state is not identical to it, but it is the central pillar without which the rest could not stand. The state also legitimises itself through ideology. Nationalism, patriotism, the flag, the anthem, all these bind individuals to the abstract body of the state, encouraging people to identify with its interests rather than their own. Schools and media reproduce the idea that the state is natural, inevitable and necessary. Today, politicians double down on these myths by promising law and order, by demonising immigrants or by insisting that austerity is a patriotic duty. To imagine life without the state is cast as utopian at best, dangerous at worst. For anarchists, this is a problem. The state is not a neutral referee that stands above society. It is a machine for maintaining hierarchy between rulers and ruled, rich and poor, insiders and outsiders. Its laws are written to protect property and privilege. Its institutions are designed to stabilise the very inequalities it claims to manage. While it occasionally concedes reforms, votes, welfare, rights, these are offered only when struggle forces its hand and could just as easily be withdrawn. In short, the state is not the people. It is not the community. It is not society itself. It is a structure of domination that sits atop society, extracting obedience, labour and taxes while insisting that without it there would only be chaos. Anarchists reject that claim. History and everyday life suggest otherwise, that people can and do organise themselves without masters. The chapters that follow will probe this claim in detail, beginning with how the state was born, how it sustains itself through violence and division, and why, despite its many faces, it remains the same beast at heart. 23. The origins and logic of the state. The state did not fall from the sky fully formed. It emerged slowly, often violently, as society shifted from small, loosely organised communities into more centralised and hierarchical structures. Anthropologists point out that for most of human history, people lived in stateless groups, clans, tribes, villages that settled disputes through councils, customs and consensus. Power was diffuse, temporary, often based on persuasion rather than force. The rise of the state marked a rupture in this long history. the concentration of coercion into a single permanent authority. The classic story traces the first states to Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, places where agriculture and surplus created both wealth and the temptation to control it. Grain that could be stored could also be taxed. Irrigation systems that required cooperation could also be commandeered by a central power. Slowly, chiefs became kings. Kings built armies, armies enforced tribute. As James Scott notes, the earliest states were concentration camps of labour, drawing peasants into walled cities not for protection, but so rulers could extract food, taxes and bodies for war. Religion played its part, and we'll cover that in chapter 6. Pharaohs and emperors declared themselves divine. Priests legitimised kingship by claiming it was heaven's decree. Obedience became not just civic duty, but a sacred command. The state clothed itself in ritual, myth and stone, pyramids, ziggurats, temples, to remind subjects of its permanence. Violence and ideology worked hand in hand. Over time, the state refined its logic. It claimed to stand above society, to guarantee order. It insisted that without it there would be only chaos, a claim that rulers from Hobbes to modern Home Secretaries have repeated like a mantra. In Hobbes's famous Leviathan, 1651, life without a sovereign was nasty, brutish and short. The cure? Submit to a power so vast it could overawe everyone. Anarchists have long argued that the Hobbesian myth is propaganda, a story that hides the fact that people often create order themselves, while states often generate the very chaos they claim to prevent. The UK offers a vivid example of how the state emerged and entrenched itself. After the Norman conquest of 1066, William the Conqueror imposed a new centralised system of rule, seizing land and parcelling it out to loyal barons. The Domesday Book of 1086 was not simply a census, but an early act of bureaucratic domination, a way to catalogue people and resources so they could be taxed and controlled. Later, the process of enclosure from the 16th century onwards showed how the state worked hand in hand with landowners to dispossess peasants, fencing off commons that had sustained communities for centuries. What was once shared became property, policed by law and enforced by violence. Immigration, too, has always been tied to the state's logic, and we'll cover that later. Waves of newcomers from the Huguenots to the Irish, from Jews in the East End to Caribbean and South Asian communities, were alternatively welcomed for their labour and demonised as outsiders. State decided who counted as a subject, who was a citizen, who could be scapegoated in times of crisis. This pattern continues today, showing that the logic of division is not accidental, but fundamental. Modern states justify themselves through democracy, rights and welfare. But the underlying logic is the same. A central authority claims the right to command, to tax, to police. Even in Scandinavia, often held up as a model state, welfare state, the state's logics remain. Again, we'll cover that later. Generous healthcare and education systems coexist with border controls, prisons and growing surveillance. The smile on the face of the Nordic state doesn't temper the hardness of the iron beneath. What this shows is that the state is not a natural outcome of human society. It is a specific historical invention, one that entrenched hierarchy and concentrated violence. It presents itself as protector, but its origins reveal something closer to protection rackets. Rulers extracting resources while promising safety from dangers they often created. For anarchists, the logic remains intact today, whether the state wears the mask of democracy, religion or welfare. Section 24, the state and violence. If the state can be boiled down to one thing, it's its claim to the monopoly of violence. Everything else, laws, parliaments, welfare offices, rests on this foundation. Without the police to enforce, prisons to punish, armies to defend and surveillance to monitor, the state's authority will be little more than words on paper. Police are often described as public servants, keeping communities safe, but anarchists see their role differently. Police exist primarily to defend property and order, not people. A burglary may get a crime number and a shrug, but step onto the street with a picket line or a banner and you will quickly find the full force of the policing turning against you. From the baton charges against suffragettes to the mounted police at Orgreave, from the kettling of students to the harassment of travellers, the pattern is clear. The police defend the state, not the public. In recent years, this has become even clearer. France's Gilets jaunes demonstrations were met with rubber bullets, tear gas and mass arrests. In the US, Black Lives Matter protests were surveilled, infiltrated and violently dispersed. In the UK, climate activists from Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil have been targeted with sweeping new restrictions designed not to protect the public, but to protect the state from disruption. Police violence is rarely punished, whether in the UK, the US or further afield. In the UK, deaths such as Ian Tomlinson at the G20 protests in 2009 or Chris Kabar in 2022 led to outrage but little accountability. Prosecutions are the exception, not the rule. In the US, the murder of George Floyd in 2020 resulted in a conviction only because of overwhelming video evidence and mass protest, while the vast majority of police killings faced no charges at all. In France, police who blinded protesters with rubber bullets during the Gilets jaunes movement walk free. In Brazil, police massacres in favelas are routine, with inquiries stalled or buried. The pattern is global. The state shields its enforcers because their violence is the foundation of its authority. Lock 'em up. Prisons are another pillar. Officially, they are places of rehabilitation. In reality, they are warehouses of the poor, disproportionately filled with those failed by housing, upbringing, education and healthcare. Prisons remove problem people from sight, while doing little to address the roots of harm. Anarchists argue that prisons reinforce the very inequalities they claim to correct, punishing poverty while leaving corporate fraud, environmental destruction and state violence unchallenged. Nowhere is this clearer than in the US, where over 2 million people are imprisoned, the largest prison population in the world. Black Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites, a continuation of racialized control that stretches from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration today. Prisons there are big business too, with private corporations profiteering from cheap prison labour and overcrowded cells. The UK has its own prison crisis, less visibly globally but equally revealing. England and Wales have one of the highest incarceration rates in Western Europe. Overcrowding is endemic, with prisons regularly operating at or above capacity. Privatisation has made matters worse. Companies like G4S and Serco run prisons for profit, repeated scandals over abuse, understaffing and unsafe conditions. Racial disparities mirror those of the US, if on a smaller scale. Black people make up just over 3% of the population, but account for around 13% of the prison population. Prison is not a neutral tool. It reflects and reproduces the inequalities of the wider society. Scandinavian prisons are often held up as a counterexample, humane facilities where prisoners have private rooms, access to education, even cooking classes. Norway's Halden prison is regularly described as the most comfortable in the world. Incarceration rates are lower. Norway holds about 60 prisoners per 100,000 people, compared to more than 130 in England and Wales, and over 600 in the US. Yet for anarchists, the comparison does not absolve the state. Scandinavian prisons may be gentler, but they still embody the same logic, isolating individuals from communities, legitimising punishment as social order, and reinforcing the state's monopoly of violence. Even these model systems, migrants and minorities are overrepresented, and the state still claims the right to cage people at will. The velvet glove does not change the iron hand beneath. Our heroes. Armies project state violence outward. They guard borders, suppress colonial subjects, and defend the interests of capital abroad. The UK's history makes this plain, from the redcoats of empire to the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. The army's role has rarely been defence in any narrow sense. It's about securing resources, protecting trade routes, projecting power. The same is true globally. Whether in the US military-industrial complex or Russia's war machine, armies are not neutral shields, but instruments of domination. Surveillance culture. Surveillance has become the newest frontier of state violence, less visible but no less coercive. CCTV cameras on every high street, facial recognition at airports, digital trails monitored by intelligence agencies, all are justified in the name of security. Yet they create an environment where dissent is harder, privacy is eroded, and fear becomes internalised. As Foucault noted, the most effective prison is not the one with the biggest walls, but the one where people police themselves. In China, the state has pushed this logic to its extreme. The social credit system, powered by mass data collection, CCTV and AI facial recognition, monitors millions of citizens in real time. Access to jobs, housing and even travel can be restricted based on sources of loyalty and behaviour. Surveillance here is not just a tool, it is the fabric of governance itself. Terrorism as distraction. Since the early 2000s, terrorism has become one of the state's most powerful tools of distraction. Every attack, however tragic, is magnified into an existential threat. Newspapers scream of terror cells, government speaks of wars without end, and budgets for arms and surveillance expand year on year. Yet the scale of the actual risk is tiny compared to everyday dangers. In the UK, between 2000 and 2020, fewer than 100 people were killed by terrorist attacks. In the same period, more than 30,000 people died in road traffic accidents. In the US, terrorist attacks since 9/11 have killed a few hundred people, while gun deaths exceed 40,000 every year and car crashes kill more than 36,000 annually. Across the European Union, terrorism deaths in the last decade number in the low hundreds, while tens of thousands die in accidents, workplace incidents and preventable health conditions. Despite these figures, terrorism is framed as the greatest threat of all. Why? Because it is useful. The war on terror has justified invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, drone wars in Pakistan and Yemen, and interventions in Syria and beyond. At home, it has funded the expansion of surveillance states and armed policing, and it has funneled billions of dollars into the coffers of arms companies. The UK's arms trade offers a stark example. The Al-Yamama deal with Saudi Arabia, Britain's largest ever arms export agreement, earned BAE Systems more than £40 billion amid allegations of bribery, slush funds and political cover-ups. Investigations by the Serious Fraud Office were dropped under pressure from Tony Blair's government on grounds of national security. In the US, BAE Systems later pleaded guilty to false accounting related to the scandal, paying $400 million in fines. No executive faced prison. After 9/11, this machinery expanded into a vast global defence industry. The Pentagon budget more than doubled in less than a decade. Entire new sectors sprung up around surveillance, cybersecurity, private mercenaries and drone warfare. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon and Northrop Grumman made record profits. The terror threat became a permanent business model, a justification for endless war, endless weapons sales and endless public money diverted into private hands. In the UK, anti-terror laws grew into blunt tools of repression. The Terrorism Act 2000 granted sweeping stop and search powers and broadened the definition of terrorism to include political protest. After 9/11, the Prevent strategy encouraged schools, universities and even doctors' surgeries to monitor and report extremist behaviour, overwhelmingly targeting Muslim communities. Environmental activists, journalists and migrants have all been caught up under this dragnet. The rhetoric of counter-terrorism legitimised surveillance and policing that reached far beyond the terrorists themselves. For anarchists, the lesson is clear. Terrorism should not be ignored, but it should not be exaggerated, manipulated and instrumentalised. The real threats to ordinary people's lives are poverty, poor housing, dangerous roads and climate collapse, not terrorists. The state prefers us to fear an enemy within or any enemy abroad, because fear makes us easier to control and easier to sell weapons to. Violence under the radar. Violence also operates in quieter, everyday forms. Benefit sanctions that leave people hungry or homeless are a form of coercion. Immigration raids at dawn, with families dragged from their homes, are a form of policing just as real as riot shields. Deportation flights are military operations against the vulnerable, justified in the language of border security. These acts rarely make the headlines, but they are part of the state's arsenal of violence, targeted not at criminals or invaders, but at the poor, the migrant, the marginal. The UK has doubled down in recent years. The Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022 broadened police powers to restrict protests deemed too noisy or disruptive. The Public Order Act 2023 criminalised tactics like locking on, tunnelling and blocking roads, methods long used by environmental and social movements. These laws are not neutral. They were written to curtail dissent, making protest itself a punishable offence. When added to a long tradition of police repression, from the Battle of the Beanfield to miners' strikes, they show how the state continually recalibrates its violence to meet new forms of resistance. The pillars of state violence. The UK shows how these three pillars intertwine. The police who raid traveller sites feed people into the prison system. The army that fights wars abroad fuels anti-immigrant sentiment at home. Surveillance links it all together, ensuring that even before a crime is committed, entire groups can be labelled suspicious. Other states differ in detail, but not in essence. Whether liberal democracies or authoritarian regimes, the tools are the same. For anarchists, this monopoly of violence is the heart of the problem. States insist that their violence is legitimate, that without it there would only be chaos. But history suggests the reverse. Communities often manage themselves peacefully until the state intervenes, imposing control through force. Violence is not an aberration of the state, it's its backbone.